Welcome back to the system and our closeout for week 2 of July. This is the total solar day on the 15th, which is our general closeout for the second week. And it's been an interesting week. We've run some tests on the system where we've reduced the capacity to 50% by switching off 3 of the power walls. That went well. As you saw in the previous video, the system very quickly recalibrated itself to know how much capacity it had and just adjusted the system accordingly. And that was great news because we're planning a trip to Minnesota. And so currently I'm in the process of unpacking the car and repacking it, getting it ready to go. And while we're gone, I'm going to go ahead and leave the system set at 50%, again, by shutting off 3 of the power walls. And then that should allow us to accumulate more power down the to the grid, and then wind up accumulating power as far as our compensation goes. We are on what's called net metering, which means that all the power that we send out the line is then subtracted from the total amount that we used. And so that should bring us to neutral. We'll see what the result of that is when we get back. But while we're on the trip, I'll go ahead and do some videotaping, and we'll go over some of the highlights of traveling on electric. That should be kind of fun. But that's about it for the highlights of this week. So let's go back over to the studio, and then we'll go through the actual numbers. Welcome back to the studio. Okay, I know that I said I would give the highlights at the beginning for those who are interested in just the highlights, and so then you could get those and move on. But in this recap, actually there is quite a bit that needs to be gone over kind of in context in a couple of the tests that we did, so let's get to it. So we pick up here on the 8th where we left off, and starting the day at 21%, cool temperatures. That gave us a reduced consumption for the day, 25.4 kilowatt hours, and so that was good. And then late in the evening, I was working at the studio, so I didn't put any charge into the car and had plenty in there, so it was a good production day at 62.8 kilowatt hours, and so that was a good opportunity to bring the system up a little bit. Wound up sending 49.6 kilowatt hours to the system, so we ended this total solar day there, as you can see, at 82% with charge, and just a little bit of driving, some errands, not much, and so that wasn't an issue for not charging the car. And we got the notes again, just basically like I said, started the day at 135 miles, ended with 117, so I wasn't expecting to do much driving, and so that was fine. Let's look at that for a second. And then on the 9th, starting the day at 62%, and then I decided needed to head to the studio right away instead of charging, and so the system wound up peaking out at 100% before I managed to get home to start the charge. And so again, mild temperatures, and that's reflected in the reduced AC use, and then also the reduced overall consumption of the home. Here we see at 21.4, and that meant a tidy chunk could go to the car. And so mild temperatures, yeah. And so then, as you recall from previous videos, the car's average with me driving it like a Ferrari, it consumes about 340 watt hours per mile. That comes out to obviously 34 kilowatt hours per 100 miles. And so when you see these, oftentimes you'll see it that I put 34 kilowatt hours to the car, and the reason for that is because I'm looking to get 100 miles. That's why you see that, if you're wondering. So it's not really random, it's just me figuring out that I need 100 miles. And so here we go with the notes. So basically what I said above, starting the day at 112 miles with errands, I wanted to end the day with enough miles to give a comfortable range in case I needed the car. And quite a bit of what you see me doing as far as the range revolves around me trying to do as much driving on sunlight as possible. And so if I weren't doing the energy sovereignty project, I would just simply take more from the grid and use a little bit of grid power, draw the battery down more, and then again figuring there that anything that I used to power the home was cheaper than gasoline. And so that's going to be my mode for the coming year. But again, what you see here is a trade-off, and it's something that each of you will have to decide individually. Are you going to sacrifice a little bit of convenience for keeping the car charged at a higher level, or is the grid isolation more important to you, or maybe even necessary to you in the case of an off-grid type of a situation where you will actually be looking at this to try and determine whether or not this will work for your remote cabin or something of that nature. But at least with what we're doing here, you can see it's kind of a best case situation where if you're, where you're isolated as much as possible from the grid power. So, and then the 10th, not much driving. Temperatures again creeping up a little bit, so the home use rose a little bit. You'll see in the notes that I was trying to drive the system percentage to a point where it would reach 100% on the 11th. That's kind of my goal on this day. I was trying to get to a point where we could start to do a couple more drawdown tests as part of that video that I'll be presenting at the end of the month, where we start to look at some of our losses. But I wound up using the 11th to collect a little more data on the battery power system, and it's shutting off a couple of the power walls and that kind of a thing. But we had good production for the day, nearly 60 kilowatt hours, moderate home use, ended the day with 90% system charge. Again, nothing to the car. Again, I was trying to prep for the next day's proposed test where I would need the car partially depleted so that I could have some freeboard to draw the system down. So, and then the notes, no charge to the car, again in prep for the 11th. And then on the 11th, starting the day with a 75% to the system, I drove the system to 100% as part of that system test. And then I turned 2 of the batteries off initially, and this would allow the system to start sending power to the grid earlier than obviously with the complete system, and it did. And so then what you can see here is the result of that, with the amount to the power wall though was greatly reduced. And so then that's the result of me having to delay my drawdown test an additional day, but that here gives me quite a bit of data as far as exactly how much power the 1 or 2 of the batteries wind up using. And so that resulted here in what you see. If you're a little confused by the numbers not matching up for the day, well, that's why. Because although we did have a good day of production at 60.1 kilowatt hours, we ended the day at 89% due to sending that 15.6 kilowatt hours to the grid. And then when the batteries were turned back on after the test, then there simply wasn't enough solar production in the remainder of the day to send much to the power walls. And then also we have the increased AC use for the day. And so that reflects in the total use that you can see of 41 kilowatt hours, even though we didn't send anything to the vehicle. And so, and then the notes. And I should probably go back and amend these notes to better reflect what I just told you about the day doing the test. But I did eventually do the drawdown test on the 13th. I'll go into more detail when we hit that. And so then here is the 12th, just a little above my average driving. Put another 100 miles back into the vehicle as I needed to draw the system down below 50%, again as part of that measured drawdown that we were going to be doing on the that we'll wound up doing on the 13th. We'll talk about that in a second. But for today, good production, just under that 60 kilowatt hour mark. Home use was again up because of the high heat and the increased AC use, and some washing and baking that was done as well. So that drove the total for the day up. And so then the notes, like I said, doing another bit of drawdown, and that gets us ready for the charge test tomorrow, being the 13th. Let's look at that for a second. And so then the 13th, so right away you see some strangeness. The total solar day percentage is missing, and the reason for that obviously is because there was no way for me to accurately record it. The system did hit 100%, but then the system was drawn down to 20% and 3 batteries were switched off. And so then the idea there being that it would result in a known capacity of charge for each battery. And so then this was then verified by that drawdown test that we had done in the 2 days previous, where I verified that the system depletes all its batteries equally, at least at this stage when all the batteries are new. They were all installed at the same time. We went into that a little bit in that previous video. But this resulted in a known capacity of 16.4 kilowatts. And so then what I did next was to charge the batteries until it just started to send power to the grid, and that's why you see that noted there. And then the reason for that, that gives us that additional 0.2 kilowatt hours. We generally see that we've sent 0.2 kilowatt hours to the grid. Here you're seeing 0.4, and that this is why. And so the test was a success. The system recalibrated itself to 100% at 41 kilowatt hours capacity, and that resulted in the system showing full at what would have been about half capacity, and started sending power to the grid. And so in the notes, and again, that's basically just what I said. Until Tesla gives us the ability to reduce the power that the system will charge to, like we do with the car, then the only way that we can do that is by shutting off power walls in summer. And that might help to cut losses in the system, especially those vampire losses that we were talking about, as well as increasing system longevity and speed to return on your investment. If you don't need that additional capacity to get you through the evening, then turn them off. And so then that way the system will come up to 100% sooner, start sending power out to the grid, and then that might help you if you're in a net metering type of a situation. And then finally, in regards to, as you see here on the 13th, I need to make a round trip to the Bay Area, and so the start of the day percentage represents that. And that again also as part of that drawdown test, I was able to get the car fully charged and use that power to the vehicle to help with the test to get that power down. So, and then on the 14th, again, pretty standard operating day. I was gone for that day, returning later on in the day. Good production day, 61.4 kilowatt hours. Total home use represents that charge that was put to the car when I got back. And at 41 kilowatt hours, the home did use quite a bit of power due to the increased heat for the day and AC use, as we discussed before. And this is what makes our yearly average get to that 30 kilowatt hour a day mark this time of year, and through August. Sometimes you'll see a normal home use in the 50 to 60 kilowatt hour range. And then the notes. Again, I left a quick note here to explain that the starting and ending miles and the charge was just a coincidence, but it did reflect that 100 miles to the car. Give you a second with that. And then on the 15th, where we end it here, another high heat day with nearly 50 kilowatt hours of usage for the home. And you know, that's with nothing but the AC use alone. And so starting at 18% system charge, was drawn down to 28% by that 14 kilowatt hour charge that went to the car. And that covered the daily usage of the vehicle. And still make sure that we make it through the night. And so then the notes, basically what I said, the vehicle ending the day with what it started with, around 120 miles range, and I guess I needed it for a short trip or so. And that's basically it. So closing this out, we're getting ready for a road trip. I'll cover that in both next week's update as well as a special road trip video that outlines some of the vehicle prep and showing some photos that we took along, that we're going to take along the way, and give you my impressions of the vehicle stops. Currently we've calculated out we're going to need something like 14, 15, 16 projected stops to get to Minnesota and then get back, and so that should be kind of fun covering some of those. And we also have a vehicle coming, or video coming here, where we'll get a chance to have a look at Tomas's system as his install is taking place shortly after we'll return from that trip to Minnesota. And very excited for you, Tomas. That's going to be a real neat thing to see. And as always, you know, leave questions that you have in the comment sections, and we'll see you next time.